You've asked what the benefits of an artificial reef are. You have to understand what an artificial reef does first. Anytime you drop an object into the water or place something on the bottom or anywhere in the water, even at mid-depth and near the surface, fish are attracted to it. Fish are, the term is called thigmotropic. They're attracted to any kind of a stationary object. When you go fishing, you look for things like, in freshwater, a downed tree stump or rocks. When you go fishing out here, you go off Crane's Neck, you go off Mackinac Beach and Callahan's Beach. There are boulders and whatnot far offshore out there, and there's another place called the Brickyard out there where a barge load of bricks were dumped. That creates substrate or an uneven bottom or profile or something that provides structure that fish are attracted to. So initially, the minute you put something in the bottom, fish will be attracted to it. But in order to get a real reef community, you've got to get things growing on that, and that takes time. And that's what we've got out here in the Smithtown Bay Reef. We've got anemones, we've got sponges, we've got things called hydroids that look like algae flowing off of it, and they're not. Those are millions of single-celled organisms that look like long flowing hair sometimes, and they feed off microscopic organisms in the water, both we call them plankton, zooplankton, which are animals, and phytoplankton, which is plant life. So in time, you wind up constructing or developing a community there with all kinds of fish, some that stay year-round, some that just visit for a short while and feed and then disappear and go elsewhere. Primary purpose for building a reef was to attract fish for recreational fishing. That was really the only reason. Over the years, some people thought that they mistake a reef. When we say reef, they think of something like what you find in the Florida Keys or in the Bahamas or somewhere that's close to shore and protects land. It was not built to deal with any kind of erosion control or anything like that. It's almost a mile offshore. It's 40 feet deep. It doesn't do anything to affect the shoreline in any way. It doesn't reduce wave energy or anything else, and that wasn't its purpose. In the early 1970s, an entity called the New England River Basins Commission, which is now defunct, recommended that artificial reefs be provided in Long Island Sound. Long Island Sound never had them before. The state did have a few of them in the Atlantic Ocean and one or two in the Great South Bay. They started in the 1960s. And around 1974, I was having a conversation with a young man about my age then, in our 20s, who was an employee of the town's engineering department. And we were right down the beach here at Long Beach talking about artificial reefs. And the idea of building a reef in Smithtown Bay was born during that conversation. I went back to Town Hall after that session down here at Long Beach and spoke to Fred Meyer, who was the director of planning at the time and chairman of the town's Conservation Advisory Council. These were days that preceded the town's Department of Environment and Waterways and its Department of Environmental Protection before that. I was at the time working as the town's environmental analyst in what we called an Office of Environmental Analysis in the Planning Department. And I broached the idea with Fred, and he thought it was a good idea, but felt we should take it to the Conservation Council first and see if they would give it their blessing, and they did, as did the town board. In order to build a reef, no matter what it's made of, permits are required from the federal government. That would be the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in this instance, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So I approached both, and when I met with the Department of Environmental Conservation, there was a man named Chet Zawacki, who was running New York's artificial reef program at the time and had been the principal architect of some of the reefs on the South Shore. And he suggested that rather than the town go it alone and apply for the permits by itself, that the state sponsor the project and be the permit applicant to the Corps of Engineers and to the state's own Department of Environmental Conservation. We had to come up with a plan for exactly what we wanted to do for an artificial reef, and at the time we felt given problems with landfills and the amount of space taken up in them with automobile tires, which last forever, and that there were some projects down in Florida Keys and elsewhere where people were using tires to build reefs, we thought we would give that a shot. One of the problems with using tires is that they tend to move around a lot if they're not in deep enough water. And they pretty much lay flat on the bottom and don't create what we call a substrate conducive to attracting fish that are pelagic or swim about higher up in the water column. They're great at attracting lobsters and bottom dwellers and whatnot. But it's really no more than just dumping tires in the bottom and making a mound of tires, and we didn't like that so much, so we thought we would try to engineer or design something that we thought would be a lot more productive. So we thought that we would take tires and strap them with plastic strapping tape, 3 tires at a time, with what we call concrete test cylinders inside the bead of the tires. The test cylinders are about a foot long, 4 inches in diameter. They come from concrete poured into cardboard tubes when there's a major construction job, say in New York City. When our plans were finished for the design of the reef with tires, to build pyramids out of these tires, and we selected our site in Smithtown Bay, which is right behind me here. You might see some boats out there fishing on it now. We began construction in 1976. While we were planning that work, I had a conversation with a man named Henry Honigman, who was also a ranger at the Short Beach campground on weekends. And one weekend he and I were out there alone around a campfire talking about the reef, about surface water inventory I was conducting for the town at the time. And he mentioned that he had just finished the welding for an underwater laboratory at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. And we decided that since I had limited bottom time using conventional scuba, it would be very difficult and very time-consuming to use conventional scuba alone to try and build this reef and then study the colonization of it over time as it was built. We decided to add what was called SUNY Lab to the reef as an observation platform, a place where we could spend a day or so at a time on the bottom, working out of it, entering and exiting in order to both build the reef. So in this instance, SUNY Lab would be a resting place for us so that we could do our heavy work and our heavy lifting and whatnot, go back inside the lab and relax. It was relatively primitive at the time. It had a hardline telephone to the surface, so we could talk to anybody that might be up there and we could tell them what we were doing. We could ask people to drop more tires in a specific place and we would then take them, add them to the reef. So that was the original plan. Over time though, we decided to add more material to the reef. It was really the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation that called with the idea to add more material to it and make it more than just a rubber tire reef. Chet Zawacki called one day and said there were a couple of old railroad barges in the city of New York that needed to be disposed of, and Chet and a few others at DEC and I ultimately agreed that it would be appropriate to add these to the reef. These are 350-foot long steel barges that have railroad tracks on top of them, and they were once used to transport railroad boxcars and whatnot from Staten Island to Brooklyn, put them on railroad tracks and move goods out to Long Island. Those barges were in pretty poor condition after decades of use, and they needed to be scuttled. So we brought the first barge out to the Smithtown Bay Artificial Reef and sank that. Then a second barge, then a third barge, and a fourth barge made of wood rather than a steel hull and steel deck. That also led a few years later to an old oyster dredge, a little more than 50 feet in size and length, that was used by the Flowers Oyster Company in Oyster Bay Harbor to dredge oysters as part of their company operations. That also led to other materials that we placed in the reef. These are 40-foot long steel by 12-foot diameter cylinders that were used for construction jobs in New York, where they were filled with concrete, put on barges, shipped to a construction site, and then the concrete, while it was wet, was pumped out of the cylinders and used for construction jobs. The company that was doing a job in New York City didn't use the material fast enough. It hardened inside the cylinders. The cylinders became useless, and they had to dump them. They did so unlawfully in Westchester County, Long Island Sound. Got caught dumping them unlawfully, and when they were prosecuted for that, were ordered to raise them and dispose of them lawfully. And we decided that those cylinders, there are 7 of them, would be another nice addition to the reef. The governor announced that they would be adding material from the Tappan Zee Bridge to the Smithtown Bay Artificial Reef.
Everybody agrees there's a tremendous potential for artificial reefs. We just have to make it happen. We're going to take material from the Tappan Zee Bridge, which again has been cleaned and approved and has no toxic chemicals, etc. And we're going to use the old Tappan Zee Bridge for new reef construction. The reefs are different sizes and different shapes and different configurations, designed for their specific location. So Smithtown, for example, is 1.5 miles off the shore. It's a small reef. It's 3 acres. It's in 38 to 40 feet of water. And we'll have 3 vessels and pieces of the Tappan Zee Bridge.
And what we're doing here is a continuation of Governor Cuomo's groundbreaking initiative to completely expand the artificial reef system that we have here in the state of New York. We are adding 6 new reefs this summer. The governor launched the first a month and a half ago. We're doing it here in Smithtown. And what this does is it creates a whole new environment that allows for the biodiversity of our maritime life to continue, more species to be bred here, more fish to come here. And what it does is it helps the economy, because the maritime industry is equated to about $3.9 billion for the people of Long Island. It's almost 10% of the GDP. 350,000 people employed in this industry. So this is huge for the economy. It's huge for the anglers who come here, and I think this is going to be a real boon for the local economy as people come here in search of the new breeds, the new species that'll be living on this incredible artificial reef. And the genius behind it is that it takes recycled, cleaned up materials from multiple agencies from the state of New York, the Canal Corporation, the Thruway Authority, the DOT. Those materials are cleaned up, placed strategically here on the ocean floor, and over a very brief period of time, it starts allowing organisms to grow that now feed the next size fish and breeds the next size fish. And so all of a sudden, you have a whole ecosystem here that was never there before.
We'll be in about 20 to 40 feet of water. It's about a 3-acre reef location. As Lieutenant Governor mentioned, we're going to deposit materials on this reef from DOT projects, from canal projects. I want to thank the other agencies for their teamwork under this great initiative launched by the governor. And Governor Cuomo certainly understands the water. He's a boater himself, an angler, understands what it means to have locations on the bottom of the marine environment where fish can survive, and it truly is incredible. It is a matter of days before you see fish starting to find these reefs. Weeks, they begin to colonize it. By next year, it's almost unrecognizable. 5 years from now, it's like a reef with a complete ecosystem of life underneath it. And these are very important locations for habitat. Fish need structures. They need structures to colonize, reproduce, seek shelter. So we love it as fishermen. We love it as divers. Some of the structures are very attractive for the diving community as well. You know, finding material like old canal vessels, these tenders, which for many years have been sitting idly unused. Now they've been cleaned out and they've been given a new life. So we just saw a smaller canal tender with a great history and no real future now put to use. The contractors drilled some holes in the sides and lowered it into the water, let the water come in, and then slowly lower it to the bed of Long Island Sound here. In a matter of hours, all that sediment will have settled, and you're going to see fish finding this structure and beginning to colonize it. And that's really going to be an attraction not just for the fish, but certainly for fishermen and women and divers.